welcome to the first meeting of the symposium about death in 2024. You may not know, but in China, the word for four also sounds like death, so they're very superstitious about that. You're not supposed to use the word for sometimes. So in 2024, we're meeting about death. And it seems suitable, a detail probably none of you noticed. But I'm just want to introduce Michael, who needs no introduction. But Michelle, maybe it'd be good to introduce for you and remind you that. So Michael is always the person to start off the symposia with an amazing talk that really sets the stage to tackle that concept. And of course, having worked with R.D. Laing so closely for so many years, he has a way of bringing in Laing's, very often Laing's contribution to the topic, as well as the existential philosophers, and very often the Greek philosophers. And somehow, no matter the topic, including death, there's always some mention of love. And so there's no surprise that Michael will be talking about love and death, which maybe is not obvious, but when you take a moment, you think that is the best topic, and why didn't I choose that topic? But anyways, I'll give it to Michael now.
Thanks, James. All right, so the topic of this paper is love and death, and that's specifically the relationship between the two. So, of course, the key issue here is our relationship with death, generally, and all the hypocrisy and fear that our relationship with death, with our mortality, generates. Francis Bacon once said, "Whatever our faith, it's often the case that our approach to death and dying does not reflect that which we actually believe." After all, why would a Christian fear death, knowing that heaven awaits her when she dies? And why does the atheist complain about the inevitable passing when he's convinced that our time on earth is nothing more than a speck of dust in the time scale of eternity, and that we will not feel the least bit anguish once we die? Since death puts an end to all anguish and despair. Or if you believe in reincarnation, then what is there to fear when you're so certain you'll come back in this or that form? Our fear of death is not only hypocritical, it doesn't really make any sense. Yet, according to Heidegger, virtually all of the anxieties and fears that we experience from one day to the next are simple manifestations of our universal fear of death. Whenever we experience a setback, the loss of someone we love, and the anticipation that our lives will never be the same, the anguish and foreboding that we assign to this or that loss or disappointment is unconsciously generated, according to Heidegger, by the knowledge of our ultimate demise. After all, death is the most inevitable part of life. We cope with it by ignoring it and pretending that we will live forever. After all, how can we possibly comprehend our non-existence when the very thought of it is incomprehensible? Yet, it is in the presence of death that we accrue our most profound revelations. Death puts our lives in perspective, and we soon realize that all the things that we thought mattered have little relevance. This is when we begin to reflect on what is truly important. It is what causes us to reflect and to ponder. Plato believed that the fear of death inspired us to invent philosophy. in a desperate attempt to make sense of this very nonsensical and terrifying proposition. We are all going to die. One of the most common casualties of our denial of death is the way we hold back our profound affection for others whom we love until this or that person has died. Then we're consumed with the shock of it all and the grief of what we've lost. Our feelings boil over, and we regret all the things we wish we had said when we still had the time to do so. But is that grief actually for the lost person who died? Or is it the grief of the anticipation of our own death, which the passing of loved ones triggers in us? The tragedy of our relationship to death is that we don't want to see it as an essential part of living, as an ongoing cycle of life. When someone dies, and that someone doesn't have to be someone we know personally, it might be a celebrity or movie star that we adore, we act so surprised, as though that was never supposed to happen. We get lost in sympathy and even a profound sadness, as though a part of ourselves had died. Funerals are a case in point. We gather together to bid farewell to the loved one, and we are expected to wear a sad face, because this is such a terrible thing that this person's life has come to an end. While in truth, we're dreading the inevitability of our own demise. One of the things I admire about how the Irish reject all of this. The wake precedes the funeral, and its purpose is to celebrate the life of the deceased and to get inebriated and sing his or her praises. This doesn't mean that the Irish fear death any less than others. It is simply a way of acknowledging that the focus should be on living and the celebration of what that person's life meant to us. And in turn, how precious our own lives are, and to relish it while we can. It's an attempt to remember that there is a tragedy even greater than death, the tragedy of the way we choose to live, or not to. We look at the world and see endless war, death, murder, suicide, and a horror show that has persisted since the dawn of the human race. Life seems so tumultuous, so unpredictable, and dangerous, and fragile. Anxiety consumes us, and we busy ourselves with work and other distractions while life passes us by. It's no wonder that we cry when someone we love leaves us. We never really got to know them. So we hold on, clinging to the illusion that what was still is, when the truth is that which was can no longer be, and perhaps never was. We cling to memories that were never true, desperate to remember something good. We're consumed with regrets and the inevitable frustrations that are unavoidable, never realizing that life continues to blossom on our doorstep, never comprehending that life has no end, no beginning, no high, no low, no middle. It just is. What does it take to wake up, to smell the flowers, and to recognize that the only thing that matters are the people that we love, the things we love to do and look forward to, and to love the life that we're living, and be grateful for what we have, and not resenting what we don't. After all, this is the only life, as far as we know, that we will ever have. So what about the role that love plays in our lives, and the relationship between love and death? The inspiration for my talk I want to share with you this morning came from a distinction that Heidegger once made between death and demise. He observed that demise is the death of our bodies, when our lives have come to an end. Death, on the other hand, is something we live with. We never actually experience our death because death is the termination of all experience. We may feel that our bodies are dying with a terminal illness, but death itself puts an end to all that. We never know what it means to actually die. Yet we experience death all the time, symbolically, existentially, emotionally. It is the most painful experience that we can possibly bear. This experience is most poignant when our hearts have been broken, when we lose someone we love dearly, even desperately. Freud once said that unrequited love is the most painful experience humanly possible. He also suggested that it is the source of all our psychopathology. This is because anxiety drives all neuroses, psychoses, everything listed in the DSM. Nothing makes us more anxious than knowing we have lost someone who has literally become a part of ourselves. And that part of ourselves that resides in the relationship that we once shared has to die in order for us to be free to love again. What are the signs to suggest that love is the dissolution of ego boundaries? Wait a minute. Looks like I'm missing a page.
You should demise or to the death in the page.
Well, I was going to talk about Freud and the dissolution of ego boundaries. Oh, here it is.
Got resurrection.
So in Plato's Symposium, he suggests that at least 3 ways in which we love, that love and death might be connected. First, that love entails a willingness to die for one's beloved. Second, that love is a desire for a kind of death, the death of our ego, when it merges with the person we love. And third, that love is linked to our mortality and the desire for immortality. We want our love to last forever. I want to focus on how the loss of a loved object can inspire us to believe that without this love, our life is effectively over, because our life will never be the same, that the happiness we knew is done with, that a part of us has died, and that this feeling may be the closest we'll ever come to experiencing our actual death. We may even choose, in a moment of desperation and intolerance, to end our life, because it has now lost all its meaning and purpose. Though we typically associate suicide with depression, we sometimes overlook the possibility that many, perhaps most suicides are triggered by the loss of a person one loved dearly, perhaps the most important person in one's life. Freud believed that we associate death with risk, which is why so many neurotics are risk averse. So they avoid risk at every turn, seeking a kind of safety or security that doesn't exist. But what is it precisely that we are risking and avoiding? Both Freud and Heidegger believe that when we fall in love, ourselves merge with the love object, and that the two of us become a we. Freud even defined love as the dissolution of ego boundaries. For Heidegger, it's more complicated. So what are the signs that love is the dissolution of ego boundaries. That when falling in love, each person, each self, in a sense dies and generates a new self that merges with the other's perception of me and generates in turn a new self that each of us becomes, a self that only exists between us. This is because, according to Heidegger, there is no fixed self, as we ordinarily assume. We aren't the same self from the time we form one, around 6 months of age, until the day we die, however old we may be. The self is by its nature fluid, elastic, and multifaceted, always changing, always becoming. We have the illusion of a fixed self and permanent self because we have a memory. And the self that remembers and relishes past events leads us to assume that this is the same self that experienced those earlier events. But it isn't. Not only is our self or selves constantly changing, we are different selves with each person we enjoy a relationship with. I am one self or person with the woman I love, and a different self with each of my friends, my children, my colleagues, my work, and each and every person I meet anew. This can be confusing, and no doubt generates a lot of anxiety in us, some more than others. For example, the person who is socially averse. So who are we, really? This is why Heidegger distinguishes between an authentic self and what he calls a they self, which is akin to what Winnicott and Lang call a false self, or what Sartre calls bad faith. This is a self we derive from others who see certain qualities in us: funny, charming, sexy, impatient, loving, dismissive, and so on. Those qualities in turn become a part of who they take us to be, and which we in turn adopt, so we become that person with them. If we find that the disparity between our self-perception, the self we take ourselves to be, and the self that a friend or colleague projects onto us becomes too incongruent, we're likely to end that relationship. We want to be perceived as a lovable, or at least likable person, and we in turn seek relationships with people we ourselves love. There's nothing necessarily pathological or neurotic in this, so long as we don't lose sight of our authentic self, the person I genuinely take myself to be. If I happen to lack confidence in myself, if I don't love myself, I'm more likely to lose sight of the self that I take myself to be, and go along with how others want me to be. I don't do this out of love, but compliance. Though compliance can generate attachments to people, it is a kind of attachment that only serves to exacerbate the alienation that I already experience at the core of my being, at the heart of my self-regard. This is likely the person or self that took me to therapy. It is a self I'm ashamed of, a self that I secretly loathe, and a self that I cannot bring myself to love because this self doesn't love me. It is a self that is consumed with guilt and self-pity. These are not likable attributes. It is the self that has been sorely damaged, originating in the earliest stages of my childhood and parental relationships. On a more positive note, Heidegger introduces a third self, a sort of we self, that springs to life whenever two people become fond of each other. This has to be one of the richest experiences humanly possible. This is a more beneficial and authentic kind of self and other that we co-create with the people we feel closest to, the people who love us, the people with whom we feel most intimate. It is epitomized by the people we fall in love with, and generates what I'm calling a kind of co-constructed self. Over time, I begin to see myself as the person who I love sees me. That person, in turn, does the same with me. She begins to see herself as the woman I adore. This generates an experience of intimacy that, as Freud notes, is born from the dissolution of ego boundaries. This is a wonderful feeling, and it makes us feel reborn. It leads us to believe that this person knows us better, knows us more intimately than anyone else. However, some people are alarmed with the experience of having their self dissolve into a co-constructed self. Their self is too fragile to experience the loss of autonomy that falling in love invariably occasions. Whenever we fall in love, we're at the mercy of the other person. He or she holds the key to our sense of self-worth and to our happiness. This can be a scary proposition for a person who lacks the trust that is essential to loving another human being. They either fight it, or if they do submit to this experience, they won't be able to sustain it. Instead, they cling to their anxious self-identity for dear life. They may feel suffocated, engulfed, dispossessed, invaded. They may feel that something inside of them is dying, and that they cannot afford to let this happen. Lang describes some of this in The Divided Self. The reason I love some of my friends or lovers or colleagues more than others is because the ones I favor help to co-generate the self that I identify. This helps me love myself even more, but mostly in their company, in my relationship to them. In reality, I'm only that person with that friend or that lover, the people who co-created me. I feel most alive and secure when I'm with that person. As Aristotle once observed, love seeks proximity. The more absent we are from those relationships, the more lousy and unloved we feel. This is why we become so dependent on these relationships, and we cast our fate in their hands. These are the people we trust with our lives. George Santayana, the Spanish philosopher, once said that he who lives in hope dies in despair. It's one of my favorite quotes of Santayana, which I've repeated, I think, many times. This is a strange adage. After all, hope is so essential to our well-being. Hope is what brings us to therapy and sustains us throughout our experience of therapy until we're done with it. So what was Santayana getting at? He suggested there are times when you have to accept that your situation, despite all the hope you invested in it, is hopeless. This is when you have to be realistic. The optimist has a problem with this, because no matter how dire your situation may be, when, for example, you've been rejected by somebody you love, you want to believe it will somehow work out if you're patient, if you don't lose all hope. Santayana astutely realized that everyone, sooner or later, faces a moment in their lives when they simply have to let go, and to let the love they clung to die. The pain of this moment, the pain of abandoning hope, is at the heart of our being, the experience of something dying. And yet, when it does die, and you will know when it does, you find yourself in a better place. You begin to feel reborn, and eventually you're free to love again. Yet, in order for that to happen, there's no choice but to succumb to that very experience that all of us tend to avoid, the experience of what it feels like to die. The more we avoid this experience, in both the literal and symbolic sense of the term, the more we become enslaved by our fear of death, and the more anxiously we live our lives. I know that some of you will have a problem with this proposition, that our anxieties are invariably tied to our fear of death, the fear of our own demise. After all, Freud surmised that our anxieties are keyed to the fears that we have about our desires, the fear of experiencing disappointment. He even posited a dual instinct theory later in his life, the so-called death drive, where he proposes that the healthy part of us is driven toward eros, which can be translated as either love or life, and that the anxious part of ourselves, in seeking to diminish our anxieties, are driven toward thanatos, or death, where all of our psychopathological symptoms reside. But was Freud literally talking about death, what Heidegger calls demise? I don't think so. I think Freud was trying to get to a more Heideggerian reading of death. Not a literal death, but an existential one. In this reading, the death drive doesn't suggest that we're actually seeking to die, though this does sometimes occur. Instead, we're simply trying to deaden our desires by suppressing them, which is the root of all our neuroses. In this reading, the healthy person readily accepts their mortality, scary as it is, and accepts as well the uncertain and transitory aspects of living. In so doing, they're less likely to avoid giving birth to their desires, knowing all the while that they cannot ensure their survival or their longevity. This is because life, love, and death are inextricably linked. It isn't an either-or proposition, to live or to die. We are doing both all the time, and our quest for love lies at the heart of this dialectic, for better or for worse. Thank you. So,
Yes, it's
that's a mood killer if there ever was one.
yes, very heavy. But maybe it's a good time to just open it up for questions, and I think a very evocative paper.
It is a very evocative paper, and I think it puts it in context a lot of really very significant questions. And I think, the main thing is the real focusing on various questions and our putative answers to them. And I think some of us will have different answers to these questions, but that's good. That's a discussion. So I just had a few issues. As an example of the fact that I do think it's very, very stimulating and really fascinating thoughts. Actually, get me thinking, even in the morning for me. I did have a Pete's coffee. I got it does help. So, one of the things it came to mind right towards the end of the paper is about, well, when we're talking about the self, we're talking about the nature of the self as such. And then we're saying, well, we have different selves, different people, as Marcus has discussed, all that. And when we know who the real self is and what's a false self, so whatever. And the thing that came to mind for me was the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's ideas about the meaning of words. And he said his idea was really that there wasn't any essential correspondence. His later work was whether there isn't any special essential correspondence between the word and the reality. It doesn't. It's not like there's a shoe there, and shoe means that, and correspondence theory of truth is like that as well. You know, something's true by the fact that it corresponds with reality somehow, and you work that out. Anyway, he had there's an analogy you could use, and that is, say you had a convoy maybe during World War II, a convoy of ships that's going between Britain and the east coast of the United States, and there's say 6 in the convoy, and those 6, and what happens is the U-boats keep kind of, striking them, and they die, sort of thing. They sink, and somehow or other they're able to, they're able to substitute another one for that one. So what happens is, right throughout, say, for example, you've got the 6, and so in theory, the 6 original could have been sunk by the U-boats. Then you've got, say, if the A, B, C, D, E, F, you start off with A, B, C, D, E, F, and then you have, instead, F goes, so you have A, B, C, D, E, G, and so on, and then the next one goes, and A goes, and so you have H instead, and so on. And then by the time it gets to the United States, that convoy has got none of the ships that were in the original, launching. Yet, we tend to say that's the same convoy. And I think, and yet there isn't anything that is the same. It changes over time. So, I just can't. I think that's a very interesting insight into that. I mean, we do that with self. Like for ourselves, like every cell that we have, it changes over life, and they might not even be the same.
Well, they die.
They die, and another one's resurrected, and we still say we're the same body.
We're the same person, yeah.
So I don't know what that means about the nature of the self.
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing to work out what is the same, how are we the same, and when we die or have a demise or whatever, what is the meaning of that in terms of, is it the same?
Well, it's one of the most stubborn debates, I think, in contemporary society. I think most philosophers have come around to acknowledging, yes, there is no such thing as a fixed self. But commonly, people do believe that their self is fixed, that they're the same person, always have been. And I agree, that's an illusion. But there's something comforting in that feeling. And we like to think that the solidity of a self gives us security. I think my argument today is it's only if you love yourself that you feel that kind of solidity. But yeah, I think when you think about that, I think what inspired my idea for this talk was that quote from Freud, love is the dissolution of ego boundaries. I thought that was a remarkable way of putting it, because of course he's saying that that means your self dissolves. It's not going to be the same. And And that, of course, in the context of love, is a wonderful experience. There's people who have trouble loving, I think, maybe for that reason. They seek love, but maybe have more trouble experiencing it. And I think that has to do with the death and rebirth of ourselves that is going on constantly. You know, and whether we're easy with that proposition or whether we are really disturbed by it.
But I think you're saying something really profound about that this the solidity of self comes from self-love. That you can maintain the solidity of self when you really do learn to love yourself. And that takes an incredible amount of work, therapy, practice, working on yourself. But what dissolves, even in self-love, is the ego. That even in loving yourself, you have to let go of what you take to be your personality, right? And all of that it's something elusive that you're loving. So,
Well, the paradox is that it's not self-love, it's loving all yourselves.
yeah, exactly.
And
It's like accepting.
some of ourselves are pretty lousy. You know, I mean, I just think about how many of my patients say they hate themselves. And you know, that's a sad, sad place to be, obviously, because they're always condemning themselves and putting themselves down and don't feel worthy of anything. Well, that is part of their self, but it's not the totality.
Well, they're not self-loving. If they were self-loving,
There's certain selves that they cannot love, right?
Well,
But in other moments they may. But they're
Yeah.
picky.
yeah, and that's like being picky about who you
And so they're that way with other people.
Exactly.
You know, that you're going to get picky with others and be judgmental and condemn people, etc. When really we're all just winging it the best we can, you know. And what matters except the people that actually are in our lives. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump has any impact on my life whatsoever, even though we can't stop talking about it. I'm sure some people even love Donald Trump.
Definitely. Apparently, many people.
Probably including Donald Trump. It's one of his, I think one of the things he's able to do is because he does love himself so much.
That's a nonsense.
Well, not really, but
He's a complete narcissist. He doesn't know the meaning of loving himself.
Yeah, okay. I didn't want to get that. That was his role there. But I'm saying he said actually that he does have some self-love in this degree, and you might not say it's real love, because it's not fair enough.
I don't know, I think he sells people like the illusion of love, like all his followers. Something about like, you know, he's like a cult leader. Selling
yeah, it's an erotic kind of love, I think, that he elicits. They get excited about him.
And a steak, and a free steak.
Yeah, free stuff.
His children seem to love him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
Which is perplexing. But I thought it was great. Like taking off, I think I said this last year, but when I first met you, I was struck by two things. One was your kindness, which is actually quite rare in psychoanalysis. They're often aloof and not that accessible. And the other thing was just love, you know, the centrality of that love in your work and the emphasis of that. And again, in psychoanalysis, it doesn't seem to have the same level of emphasis. And, you know, it's hard to recreate it in a lab, so we're moving away from those less empirical things. But I'm really glad you brought in self. I think that's you've started the ball rolling, because the question is who dies. You know, and I think that that's an important question.
What's it called?
Who dies? And I don't think it's a coincidence that, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, when they have a altered experience, whether it's psychedelics, breathwork, or whatever, and there is a more transparent experience of the ego, love flows. It's like,
Well, I think so. I think psychedelics also elicit a dissolution of ego boundaries, and that experience makes you feel more loving, and you feel love from the universe and from everything around you. That's if you can roll with that, with having your ego dissolved in that way. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it elicits a contrary reaction and elicits a lot of anxiety. Maybe the timing wasn't right or the conditions. That was something Timothy Leary always talked about, how important it is that you're in the right place, the right time, with the right purpose. You don't just, do it haphazardly. And maybe falling in love is the same way. It's something one has no control over. You can't make yourself love somebody that you don't, and you can't make yourself stop loving someone that you do. So in a way, control goes out the window, with all this, and I think with our relation to death. But I was very intrigued with this idea of Heidegger's that death is something we live with constantly, all the time, and that yes, of course, it's an unsettling thought. One day I'm not going to exist. I won't be around to mourn that and regret it. But the idea that I am never going to exist is so incomprehensible. Heidegger thought that for the most part we don't really experience that angst, that anxiety, but occasionally we get a whiff of it, and when we do, we have a moment of real sheer terror, which we cannot really live with. We need to get a distance from it, and then of course realize that we're coping with it in all these other ways that we are dying. All the disappointments, all the frustrations, all the stuff that we do complain about in our lives. That's really, he's saying, where we meet our death. That we wouldn't have anxieties at all about things if it wasn't the fact that our life isn't going to go on forever. Yeah,
Mike, by the way.
Nina had a question.
Sorry, I didn't realize.
So I'll be sort of talking more about this in my presentation, but I think the sort of two potential parts of death. I mean, one is I'm not going to be, but the other part.
Just a little bit louder.
So I conceive of it in sort of at least sort of two parts. One of them is the cessation of being, but the other part, at least as we're living and contemplating death, is the loss of our world and everyone in it. And I think that speaks to the role of love. And so there's the anxiety about not being, but I think there's also significant anxiety and all sorts of other feelings about I'm going to lose everyone I love.
Yeah, if you live long enough, you're going to lose all the people that you love in your life.
Yeah.
And usually, you're in your 90s usually when that happens, if you live that long. And very often people feel like they have nothing more to live for. They lived a great life, but that life was rooted in the people that they were so close to and were meaningful to them, and they're ready to die.
Some people I know who are that old, like, well, my friends have died, sort of feel like, even like atheists said, I just want to go join them again.
Yeah, well. I'm sorry, Doug, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say that it was really a follow-on. That was the reason I said. I think you made a very good point just now about the fact that sort of the death of others is a sort of alert to us. You know, it breaks a chain, you know, because we're going along in our lives thinking, oh, it's not, you know, okay, other people die, there are wars, but when it's somebody who we actually go to a funeral of, someone who's close enough to us to go to a funeral, that alerts us to our own inevitability of our own death, and it's going to happen to us sometime, and we do identify with that, and I think that's all true, and the only thing I'd say is that I think that when we are confronted by that, and I'm thinking, you know, we'll do, but as we get older, we have a lot more people we know who are dying. And when I've come across such things, if I see them, if I see, oh, they died and they're 95, I feel some relief. But if they're 75 or something, I think, oh, fuck, you know. So there's that. Okay, and I really agree with you on that. I really think it's true that is one of the things. One of the first things you do is you check it yourself. You say, yeah, okay, oh, what a relief. So that's that. But on the other hand, there's far more to it than that. I mean, in fact, partly when you get that shock, you get the alert, oh, and also a bit of relief, it's not me, but God, it's going to happen to me soon or later. We also have room in our heads to feel real, genuine grief about the other person, and I don't think it's related to us. So I think that I just think the thesis needs a bit of toning down in that sense of just say a part of the issue when you die, you know, of death is of somebody else's death is your own.
Well, I think I'm arguing that there really is no such thing as a distinct self and a distinct other.
Yeah.
That we're merged all the time with people that we love.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when a person dies and you're at their funeral, a part of you died with that person.
Yeah, that's true.
That's what we're mourning.
Mm-hmm. But we're also mourning. But I still think, because if you're talking about love, we do talk about this. It's not just the narcissism. It's that you have a real care for the other. So, yeah, but I care if somebody dies, somebody I care about dies. I feel this thing about me that you've talked about, but I'd say the overwhelming thing, really, for me, is my upset that they're dead for them.
Well, I think there's a difference between losing someone who has died and they're never coming back, and losing someone who is still alive, where this hope thing comes into play. As long as they're not dead, there's some possibility that this love isn't dead either. But when a person, and that's where I think you have to resolve that. We're going to be stuck in it. But when a person dies, I think you can continue loving that person. And we usually do, don't we? We go to their graves, we talk about them, we honor them. We have very warm memories of them. And in that sense, we're keeping them alive in our hearts. So in that sense, yes, they've died and they haven't really died. So it's complicated. It's life and death thing.
Yeah. James, Joyce, and sorry.
Yeah,
Just
Well, I'd like to comment on that too, that we were talking about at the end. But first, the idea of loving the other, conversation that you two were just having, or loving oneself, all of oneself, or all of the other. And Nita, you said, like, like even the unsavory parts, or the rotten parts, or the dark parts. You said accepting. And I want to find another word besides accept. Like to love, if I love that the person is currently constructed, and their unsavory parts is, I don't know what the word is, I'm still searching for it, but because acceptance is like, yeah, I'll still love you anyway type of energy, but can I love somebody fully? And I don't know what the answer is, but that's as an aspiration. But this idea about hope, I try to touch on this too on Sunday, but to overlay hope in some reckoning with death, that the death will happen, the death of the other, or my own death, and then this notion in the existential intersection of freedom or choice or agency, that somebody has this in their agency, if I truly honor that they can leave at any time. And so whether it's death of the person, of the body, or the end of the relationship, why are hopes dashed? Just like you were saying in the beginning, why would the atheist be so crushed by death, or afraid of it, or anxious about it? Why would the Catholic be so afraid? If I truly believe in autonomy or agency, and I don't want the person to go, and I hope they stay, it's like hope with no guarantees. That's the place I think where a reckoning with death, at least in my own fantasy, or some ideal place of, there's a word, acceptance. It's not the right word, but like grieving without hope being dashed. I don't know, something along those lines I'm trying to articulate.
Well, I think hope is a kind of love.
Is it kind of what?
Love. Because hope is always something positive. It's something you're looking forward to, something you're wanting, and something that you're pursuing. Perhaps you're biding your time. But I don't think we can understand hope without knowing that it's an addition of love. Some people are, like, certainly some schizophrenic patients of mine, for example, have no hope in their lives. That it's too dangerous, it's too risky. They have a hard time talking about anything being pleasurable. So hope, I think, is vital to us. I think it's one of the healthiest parts of us, that we're always looking at the glass half full. We're optimistic. We think things will work out if we persevere, if we have our hearts in it. That's not always true, which was Santayana's point, that sometimes actually all the hope in the world isn't going to make any difference. But as far as acceptance, that's what Buddhists feel is the highest kind of love, to accept everything that goes on in your life, suffering, all the rest of it. And I think I agree with that. I think accepting a person is not the same as tolerating a person, that you're stuck with, let's say. But acceptance gets rid of all the negativity, I think. You love, no better example than our friends, who we love and irritate the hell out of us and stuff, but we have total acceptance of who that person is and all their complexity. I don't think there's any higher form of love than that.
Yeah, and bouncing off that accepting one, I hear what you're saying, David, for sure, and I tend to see it as not just tolerating self first off. There's probably a better word for it. It's interesting to explore that, because it really is, it's an embracing or just letting. It's a letting be. I don't know. It's not thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's not making a list of what you're accepting. You stop doing that. well, I love this person and, you know, this
In
really.
spite of these, I got a debit column over here and a credit column.
Exactly.
Yeah, and sometimes
all
I'm just
been
a
there,
stickler too. Sometimes I just can't accept a word. Michael and Nina know this. I'm like, I want a different word.
Work on it, keep me posted.
Come up with a
Yeah,
new
keep me
word.
It's
posted.
like the word perfectionism.
Yeah, a little
It's
bit.
just so
Huh?
reified. The word is reified. I mean, perfectionism. And maybe there's a
They're not
there's
perfect.
a relationality that's missing for me in that word as well, because it implies that there's something trying to come into into being, you know, but the way has to be made in the making. You know, it's
It's like a placeholder word for what needs to happen.
and
Well, exactly.
I think what needs to happen oftentimes, if we're fortunate, or we've, you know, I don't know how many ways I could say this, but if we've been able to have a relationship with ourselves to the point of being able to hold that otherness and that alienation of our being, then something will, you know, like a practice, the otherness of the practice will sort of cook us. But I think a lot of this stuff is kind of, to Michael's point, you know, it needs another person.
Yeah.
You know, that the self is sort of, I don't know how can I say this, built for it, or, you know, it is, like he said, there's this indissoluble union between us and the people we love. And so at some point, those parts won't self-organize without, I guess, the right container or group or
It's where the
family
where
or,
the rubber meets the road.
yeah, I think it needs a kind of complexity sometimes that can exist over time in a dyadic therapeutic relationship, absolutely. But you can almost see it much more immediately in a group, you know, where the stuff starts to come up, like the family.
I think that you need to see the self in this sense as a verb, not as a noun, not as a series of nouns. There's this and there's this and there's this and there's this and there's this. Or in a verb, you're looking at it as a process of choices and experiences and it's just the action. And I think that helps that, maybe.
I know you wanted to throw some James Joyce out there, but just this might be an interesting paper or topic to bring into the curriculum next year or after.
Yeah.
This whole topic. I remember us talking about
What
this,
is acceptance?
the love part, not the death part. And like James has said, you know, of course you're gonna throw in love. I agree with Michael. One of the things I associate with you and I learned a lot from you is love. That to not miss that layering or whatever we're talking about. But I lost my train of thought there. But anyways, I think it would be
James Joyce?
No, he was gonna go James Joyce.
James Joyce.
Yeah.
They always shoehorn James Joyce. Greatest short story in the English language is The Dead in the Dubliners. But, you know, he highlights that sometimes the memory of the dead, they hold more passion in our lives, and it reflects that, in fact, we are dead and they're very much alive. I think it's a wonderful teaching.
Well, gosh, I mean, what about R.T. Lang? I mean, he's still dead, and yet still very much alive.
Yeah.
Especially for you.
Especially for me.
Yeah.
As they say, to keep the person alive.
Yeah.
I just want to say we're talking a lot about people, but I think there is love relationships with animals, as we know. Dog
Or-
here, and I see
Animals are people.
yes, others, not for me. But I see such deep grief, and I felt that too, loss of an animal, and plants also. I had a plant that fell. I thought it's gonna die. It revived itself. I was like, you know, there's loving of others that are outside of the human. I just want to say.
agree. You know, I've experienced and I've seen in other people, sometimes there's more access to those feelings of grief and loss with an animal. It's almost like, I don't know if I want to say more pure, but there's something that's just more accessible.
Well, it's almost like losing a child, I think, to
Well,
losing an animal. They're not around that long, and I mean, I still grieve the 2 last pets that I had.
Mhm. It's such a close relationship and it's a raw teaching.
And they love us so much.
Yeah.
I mean, we love them. I mean, that's talk about love.
And plants. I've had 2 trees removed and just grieved, like pre-grieved and grieved and post-grieved
Wow.
for a long time. Do you remember the willow tree, the weeping willow tree? Weeping willow tree. I was completely undone. It was taken out unexpectedly, and it just, I was like in shock. So it's a big deal.
Yeah,
Plants
yeah.
as well.
It's true. It's really tragic to lose a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So thanks for reading that.
Yeah. I remember reading this poem about a redwood tree. I can't remember who wrote it. Some 900-year-old redwood tree, and the other redwood trees had written this poem while they watched their friend of 900 years lie there, even though they knew it's time to go. Something about what you both just said. We had this major windstorm in Santa Cruz earlier this year. There's this stately eucalyptus. It's like 102. I don't know how tall it is. It's massive, and it's so right on the edge of the property. And I was sitting outside in the storm. I may have been drinking some brown liquor at the time, and there's like this rainstorm, and this tree is like almost bent in half. I'm like, please don't fall. And I didn't even raise the thing like I think the plants you two are talking about. It's like, man, if that thing would have gone down, it would have been devastating.
On my apartment complex, my landlord is getting older, and he used to come and just cut everything back. And so he's been neglecting this up to the fourplex is this, I don't know what they are, some sort of trumpet flower, but they're beautiful. And they're all these tendrils that are coming and trying to, so when I go up the stairs, I feel like Gandalf. I'm like, and I talk to them, and it's so strange, but it just comes out of me, and I touch it, and you know, I like to put my face in roses, and so on one occasion I saw a little pod, and it was kind of glistening, and I opened it, and the seeds were hearts. It was like 9 hearts. Perfect hearts, yeah. And I filmed it and sent it to my friends, and no one cared.
No one liked it?
You're right.
No one hit like? Or...
I didn't post it. But that more than human, you hear this phrase now, that this is also the way to the self. This, you know, distributed self. Nature.
But you remember we've had discussion before about the nature of life and that life. And one of the things that Lang said about love is that he compared it with the nature of love is to value it in its isness, in its true being. And I was thinking of Aristotle's view of friendship, you know, being to do with valuing the other for who they are, not for, you know, the other kinds of utilitarian reasons we might have friends, you know, for business or for pleasure or entertainment or, you know, use. You know, the true friend is somebody you value for as them, as their being, themselves. So that makes a big thing, I think, about love. Yeah, right.
A degree of acceptance toward a friend that you don't necessarily feel toward anyone else.
And you also that you accept that yes, that's really true. And then the other thing is that you care for them. Like something happens to them and it really upsets you. And as I said before, it upsets you because you'll lose them and all that, but it upsets them because you care about them for them.
Yeah, I noticed in Vietnam, there were a few incidents on our base where we were attacked, and suddenly all of us came together, and I would have gladly given my life for the person next to me. It was just spontaneous.
Yeah.
It's kind of remarkable. I've never experienced that before. And it's something about, being in danger, you're counting on each other, to protect each other, you become one unit. And so one person die, you die, it's all the same. And I'm sure that's how people get through war. I mean, it elicits a tremendous feeling of camaraderie for the people who
I think that's happening in Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely.
People there are amazing with each other, put themselves out and stand bullet, take bullets for other people.
And that transcends the whole nature of the war, because, Vietnam was an unpopular war, and nobody believed in it. But that had nothing to do with it. This phenomenon transcends that.
Yeah.
This question's out of line. It's super intense what you just said. Would you call that love?
Would
you and your buddies come?
Oh, absolutely.
That's also
absolutely
around with love.
Big time.
Yeah, I've experienced that as well. Guys fighting, taking the piss out of each other, and then when it kicks off, they're gonna stand in front of each other, take a bullet in it. The well of emotion afterwards, because it's unspoken. You just know, God, that guy was being an asshole all night, but he would have taken the bullet.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. And I would call that. I have a different word for it. I would something that for me like a higher aspiration than love.
Oh,
we
really?
talked about this in the cohort. Not to correct anybody's language, but thinking about.
Well, love is
love, loyalty, camaraderie.
As Doug was saying earlier, quoting Wittgenstein, love is just a word, and we're still learning, I think, about what it is and all its complexity and variety, and there's so many words. We have liking a person, feeling affection. There's a lot of funny indirect words that all are aspects of it. And, the Greeks had, at least 8 different words for love, for different types, different love objects, and, eros and philia, of course, being the most common, but it gets a lot more complicated. And I think we could be adding new words all the time.
Yeah, I think you're right.
What I find interesting is seeing some of those guys years later on the street and feeling the well emotion, having nothing in common with them other than we served together. It's transcended something. But also I would say that it's also, I don't know what your experience was, but it's created, certainly an infantry unit it's molded to come together.
Yeah.
The common enemy is the drill instructor. Something, you march together, you eat together, you sleep together. So there's something molded, I think, as well. But it seems to work because when the shit hits the fan.
But there's a connection. There's a connection that's established through work, if you like.
Yeah.
Work in the general sense of you're working together, you're doing things, and you have sort of at an unconscious level, It isn't just that, oh, this is useful to each other and we're benefiting each other, and, it's better the whole's bigger than the sum of the parts. It's actually that you have a bond attachment to them.
Sacrifice, yeah. And also the mindset of you're already dead. So as an infantry soldier, the mindset is you're already dead, so that you don't have to fear it. So if you get out, that's the exception.
Well, they have all kinds of tricks, don't they? I remember in basic training, the first thing they do is shave your head.
Yeah.
That's because you look at yourself and you don't know who that person is.
You lose your.
They're creating a new self for you, a fighting soldier, whose one mission is to kill the enemy. And you go about learning different ways of killing people. And but because of that dissolution of your ego, you form a new ego identity in that context. That's what you become. It's very clever.
Like in that definition of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the loving.
No.
With another person.
No, I think this goes back to the Romans. They figured this out, how to turn people into soldiers.
But taking them out of a singular sense of ego identification into a sense of collective sense of ego identification.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and of course the Greeks and the Romans were all talking about the self, even back then.